Okay, I want to thank our speakers also for adhering very closely to time. We started late. We have a very packed day, so I ask you in your interventions to be as succinct as possible so that as many people as possible can be part of the conversation. Yes?
Thank you. This was absolutely fantastic. So I have this question for Eric, because I was really interested and very skeptical of your use of political psychology as any sort of generative approach to the study of fascism and nationalism. So my question is, would you apply these psychometric approaches also to bourgeois liberalism and Marxism? And if so, right, because the problem, and here's my skepticism of psychometric, psychosocial analyses, of romanticism, or what you call the supernatural imaginary, is that it converts very awkwardly an anti-enlightenment worldview into an enlightenment framework. That is, enlightenment thinking sees the universe as knowable, observable, measurable. That's our paradigm that we work in as well as within the academy. Whereas romanticism, by its very nature, is a rejection that everything can be knowable, observable, measurable. And in fact, that this is not a bug, but this is its feature. This is its entire appeal. It's a return to mystery, to unknowableness. So yeah, what you would think about, like, because what I worry what will then happen is then it'll put a normative distinction.
Keep it short.
Okay, yeah, all right.
I'm going to take a few questions at a time. Andy Robinbach.
Diana.
Yeah, and then you will take those four, and then we'll.
You know, I think that the context of the Stanford seminar was that they came together to argue against the basic premises of totalitarianism theory, the equation of fascism with Soviet communism, and that's one. And the other thing was the liberal interpretation of fascism, which was just militant rejection of the undemocratic nature of the phenomenon. This was their aim, was to cut into that. And I wonder if it isn't the case that there was too much focus on the distinction between fascism and nationalism, and not enough attention to some of the commonalities. I was thinking of the fact that for fascists, democracy was plebiscites, not parliaments. They were
democratic elements in fascism. They saw them Volksdemokratie, Carl Schmitt.
Right,
Absolutely, yeah.
but they was focused on the authenticity of plebiscitary democracy rather than parliamentary democracy.
Okay, so thank you again for an excellent panel. My question is for Mercedes. I'd love to know a little bit more about the relationship between Vargas and Mussolini vis-a-vis foreign and economic policy. Since so many Italians lived in Brazil under Vargas's dictatorship, even as Mussolini rose at home.
Aristotle, you're the last on this round.
Thank you very much for your contributions. Given that all the elements that you have outlined, the radical, the romantic, the liberal, and so on and so forth, existed more or less in all cases that we're talking about, but played out differently in each case. When we are constructing genealogies of that relationship, what role can we afford to contingency rather than path dependency in assessing the outcome in a comparative context?
Okay, respond to these and then we'll take some more.
Okay, excellent. So, Austin, great question. I've never seen as much postmodern skepticism as I have working with quantitative social scientists. They're so aware of the replication crisis. All their fields, sociology, political science, psychology, I have moved in this quantitative realm, economists, and they're getting things wrong very often. So they're very careful about saying, look, what is the theory? what would it look like, or what do historians, political scientists, think it looks like in reality, and then how can we come up with questions that can get those answers? And we worked with a statistician who wasn't just happy with correlational, and R-squared stuff. He does something called factor loading. So what we did, I'll just explain our process. You could tell me if you like this. We said, okay, my colleague in political psychology who studies conspiracy theories thinks his field is screwed up because they're just always trying to refine their conspiracism matrix and ignoring that the people doing the paranormal scale and the intuitionism scale and the border science scale or pseudoscience are coming up with the same correlations at 0.7, 0.8 to authoritarianism. Maybe there's something behind it. I'm arguing qualitatively there's a supernatural imaginary. It's not political religion per se or occultism per se, but this framework. I didn't have the tools at the time when I wrote the book. And so our statistician colleague comes along and says, well, let's see what happens if we take the existing validated scales in political psychology. So we constantly see a link between conspiracism when you give a 50 question, like people who are more into thinking the Kennedy assassination was planned by the government, right? They have questions that keep coming up reliably, and then they're higher on the RWA scale. They're more authoritarian, right? So we took, objectively, the paranormal scale, the pseudoscience scale, the conspiracism scale. We didn't change anything, and our hypothesis is there are going to be a bunch of items that transcend these scales that political psychologists are obsessed with proving as their construct, right? That are all going to map onto something preceding those scales, and going forward will map onto being authoritarian and social dominance. And we took those because there isn't a fascism scale yet. And Americanists don't even know that Adorno founded their field. So Adorno was trying to measure fascism in 1950. They think RWA and SDO are measuring something in American culture, American exceptionalism. So we just took their scales, and guess what happens? Give it to 400 people on M-Turk, and the people who were higher on Loch Ness Monster, Dead Grandma, Area 51, there were like 10 items through the factor loading that were like 0.9 correlated, better than the individual scales, with being high on, I don't believe in parliamentary compromise. I think that there are natural hierarchies, all the existing for 40 years in political science scales. So our hypothesis, we did publish on this, is there's something behind it. We're calling it romanticism because we think Lovejoy did a good job of explaining why people are having those affinities, right? I could get into that, but I don't want to take up more time. So I'll leave it at that. So the liberal, Andy was bringing up the fact that they were there. There's motivated reasoning into why they were there. Absolutely. Totalitarianism theory, which can be helpful in measuring certain kinds of broad, isn't that helpful in thinking about fascism, because fascism is emerging, I would argue too, in bourgeois, capitalist, industrial or post-industrial democracies, and when we have communism actually working, it's in the opposite kinds of societies. So yeah, that's probably what they were doing, but I don't think that undermines what they I think they came up with some good ideas. And then the other one, Aristotle, I'm not quite sure. I think all three of us did a good job of saying, absolutely. The whole thing that Enzo presented about post-fascism, I think all of us would push back and just say, fascism, liberalism, are always in a state of becoming, or like in the case of Franco, I think the mobilizing myth became a lot less important and tourism a lot more important by 1975. So yes, but are there always people with romantic proclivities, therefore susceptible to fascist conceptions of the world? Yes. And do they get mobilized? They were all in the Democratic Party in the 20s. It was the Klan and all those folks. Now most of them are in the Republican Party in our country. They're always there. They always believe in Area 51. Who's able to mobilize or whatever, right? That's my short answer to that.
Thank you for those questions. Diana, I think there's a lot of work to be done still on, to use the term that Pamela mentioned, just the colony in Latin America, for example. I think that's a field that will show some interesting things. So I cannot answer specifically about Vargas, but what I can tell you, because I think that's where you're going with it, is from what I've seen in the case of Latin America, and I look at it through the lens of what role does Spain play in these interactions. The issue that you have there is that, yes, the colony are very useful economically, culturally, but the problem that fascist Italy and Nazi Germany specifically have is that by 37, 38, most governments in Latin America have established huge restrictions on what they can do and what their citizens are allowed to do. So by that point, that becomes something that they cannot really push for if they don't want to also risk other relations, economic relations, etc. So that idea of trying to use the colony for economic purposes, which I know a bit more in the case of Germany, it becomes complicated. And then they need like partners to actually make these things happen, which is the case of Spain. What I can say is that in some cases, this backfires monumentally on the colony. So for example, there were many German citizens who by the end of the Second World War saw their businesses and their resources taken by the United States, even though maybe they had not participated directly, but they were seen as having supported a fascist power, and therefore they had to be punished. So I think I have not looked into it in detail, but I think there's a lot there that we should actually explore. So thank you for your question.
So I have a question that troubles me along the discussion that we are having. What is the difference between liberal nationalism and fascism? No, seriously, because if we are talking about nationalism all the time without missing the part of the nation building, so the nation state. So there is the nation state and there is nationalism. What is nationalism? Is not an expansion outside, or it remains all inside? What is liberal nationalism? How a nationalism can be liberal? Not seriously, I'm serious, because otherwise we are going, using like metonymic names in addressing questions that I agree totally with Professor Rabinbach on the fact that was there a discussion around the differences.
I have a small question.
Stand up.
Okay. Yeah, for Eric. I agree with Donatello, so I will not repeat what he wrote in different words. But I have some doubts on your interpretation of Giovanni Gentile's thought. But my question is about a different topic. You used the adjective transhistorical, and yesterday also Enzo did the same. So I have a problem because I don't understand the meaning of transhistorical. I mean, do you mean philosophical? Do you mean metaphysical? So can you explain, please? No, because, if fascism, what do you think about fascism, Is fascism a concrete political regime, or is it an attitude, a psychological...
Mark?
In the imperialism panel yesterday, Roberto was talking about the importance of the international order after First World War in shaping fascist imperialism, make it distinctive. And it suddenly struck me today, from also the thing you were citing from John Connolly and then from some of Mercedes' comments, that maybe the really distinctive thing that marks out fascist regimes is the international order that they find themselves in. Mm-hmm. And actually, that the conversation of its example was very much about the internal generation, but actually the grid that lets it come to power is very much linked to an international order of frustration, a lack of coherent leadership. The existing system doesn't seem to be delivering rewards, plus the fear of the spread of communism, creating a kind of an international context, which in the end is the decisive producer of the character of these regimes.
Enzo?
Yeah. I would ask you to...
Stand up, I think it's easier.
I would ask you to come back to the relationship between nationalism and irrationalism. It seems to me that 19th century romantic nationalism wasn't necessarily irrational. But one of the most peculiar features of fascism lies it seems to me, in its capacity to combine a mystical and mythical conception of nationalism, which is certainly irrationalist or a form of irrationalism, with instrumental rationality, which is not irrational at all. Well, the traditional interpretations of the Lukács' interpretation of fascism as the accomplishment of irrationalism is probably very problematic. But what do you think about these relationships?
Do you want to start? Sure. Thank you. I will particularly focus on Manuela's question because I think that overlaps as well with some of what Enzo was mentioning. I have to say, well, of course, I got Eric's paper 4 days before my daughter was born. So the minute I saw that question, I thought, are they really different? So I did have that same problem that you have. So it was by trying to answer it that I started to think, are they not? Because, of course, you mentioned expansionism. Well, liberal nationalism is expansionist as well, can be expansionist as well. So that maybe that's not the defining difference. However, we often talk about how we need to this is something that Roger Griffin used to say, but others say as well, we need to take the fascists seriously. And Federico was saying yesterday, we need to know what they're saying, right? So they clearly reacted to so-called liberal nationalism, and they saw themselves as a different nationalism. So there's something there clearly, right? I think by working on this, I think the irrational element is important. Am I saying that there are no irrational elements in liberal nationalism? I'm not saying that, but I wonder if maybe a difference is that prompt to action. Is the fact that not constantly, because it depends on the circumstances, I think fascist nationalism tends more to try to use this myth and these irrational elements to prompt action from the people to do something, whereas liberal nationalism tends to be more content with institutions and, well, yeah, maybe we want you to prompt to action under control, right? Whereas under fascism, that action can get out of control very, very quickly. So I think that tension is important. And I wonder if the other thing that's come up already is this idea that fascism always tries to tutelize the colony, not just the citizens inside their own country, but also outside. So I wonder if that might also be something that distinguishes it from liberal nationalism, who are interested but don't seem to be so keen on the colony. But that's just a hypothesis that came to my mind. I'm not so sure is that.
Okay, so I'll try to just summarize my response by combining my response to Manuela and Enzo, which will be a bridge to Mark's excellent point. So clearly the constructivists, whether Marxist or liberal, whether Benedict Anderson is quasi-Marxist, Gellner, Hobsbawm, don't draw a clear distinction. It's an invented tradition. It may not be as bad in the 19th century. It's modal, and somehow the fascists appropriate it and do nasty things with it. In that sense, obviously, there's a continuum and process of nation building. The problem with that is we have actual ideological, legal, political distinctions. As Hannah Arendt argues quite well, even the more nationalist liberal states protected Jewish rights pretty well in the 19th century, as long as they were organized around a clear sense of nation state, and we didn't need to keep expanding and bringing in every ethnicity. They kind of gave up on a radical, what I would call more fascistic self-determination, right? Could it bleed into fascism? Absolutely, because it's always in a state, those potentials are always there. But there are differences in practice and theory in the way the liberals, and certainly Republicans like the French and Americans, view belonging in the nation state, and fascists. So I'm trying to draw those distinctions, and theorists have tried to draw them, but there's clearly a continuum, which gets me to Enzo. I don't know, I went through it so quickly. I had that quote at the beginning from Mosse, and then at the end from our article, right? And Lovejoy says the same thing. Romanticism in the late 18th, early 19th century, and not just Byron or Shelley, but also in the German, could be very freeing, liberal. Even Herder, if you read Herder, he's more a multiculturalist than he is a proto-fascist. Everyone deserves to have their own culture and ethnicity and enjoy it without a silly multinational empire telling you what to do. Mosse says at the beginning of my paper, but history matters. Revolutions, capitalism, industrialization, war, and what Romanticism in a lower register, which may have been compatible with liberalism, transmogrifies to become much more mystical, mythic, national. That would be my answer. I would historicize it. And that's why Lovejoy says you've got an idea complex, Romanticism. The ideas are there. Diversitarianism's always there. I'm not going to get into the details. The Dasganza is always there. Intuition's always there. But they become more or less pernicious depending on the historical context and the degree to which that thinking is politicized, right? Which gets me to Mark's point. This is nothing I came up with. You read Crispin Japra, Tara Zara, Ben Hett's book, right? How Democracies Die, or whatever, I think the title. They're all recognizing that fascism, maybe there are proto-fascist movements in the 1890s, but as long as they're in big, powerful empires, no one really cares. Jews can be, friends with Bismarck. It's this crisis where these empires start to see, wait, we're getting colonized and marginalized the way that India and Japan are, which creates these somewhat authentic international connections. Japan's explicitly fascist. If you read Oshima's comments about race and space and Indo-Aryan, and then you read Gentile, and then you read Himmler, they're all talking about the same thing. We're these Indo-Aryans with this great, powerful, civilizational energy coming from being Indo-Aryan, and these materialist shopkeepers and French Cartesian rationalists think they can run the world, right? So that's absolutely what's going on. That is a very important context, and that's why Tara Zara's argument, I think, against the world, they're both against the world, but as Mercedes just argued, they're for a new global arrangement. So they're against the liberal imperialist order, they're for a new fascist Axis world order. And then finally, and again, I'm moving quickly, Alessandra, transhistorical for me means, and I kind of alluded, that's why I wanted to end with this, there are concepts that at some point, because of a major historical conjuncture, in this case the French Revolution and Industrial Revolution, I think Kozelek and others would agree, new ways of thinking about the world. On the one hand, you have Enlightenment, liberal rationality with all its problems, dialectic of Enlightenment, I'm not saying it's great. And then you have a romantic reaction. We're not happy with that view of the world. We like intuition and aesthetic occasionalism and our folk. Stop telling us to be universalist, right? Once those two frames are there, those frames can continue as long as the general conditions that created that form of modernity or political economy or whatever continue. That's what I mean by transhistorical. Do I think these kinds of ideas were there in 1600 in Europe or Japan? No, right? But there can be, once you hit a certain conjuncture, certain cycles that repeat. And that's what I mean by transhistorical. And I don't think we're out of that moment. I think the 19th century created the world we're in today, and we're dealing with versions of that.
Okay, the last two speakers I have are Pam and Federico, and it's going to have to end because Sky is after me for cutting it off even before you two. These issues are going to come up again, so Pam and then Federico.
Okay, thank you so much. This is a question first for Mercedes about the internationalism and the ways in which fascist regimes made use of internationalism, but also were gesturing towards a different kind of internationalism. And I'm wondering about the politics of neutrality, not just with Spain after having had a civil war, but Salazar's Portugal, and of course the Latin American countries. So how, we talked yesterday about this inherent link between war and militarism and fascism, and yet here we have neutrality. And then on the irrationalism, just to agree with Enzo that mysticism is not the same as irrationalism, and to remind us, of course, that one of the things that Mosse and those who were inspired by him did was to have this anthropological approach to take fascism on its own cultural terms, which, coming from an anthropological training in the US, that comes from Franz Boas, who imports a Herderian notion of Volk and Kultur into American anthropology, right? So there's this kind of, I just wanted to remind us of that and to be cautious about what we're calling irrational. So, thank you.
Federico.
Yes, I have a comment/question for Mercedes. I have a comment/question for Mercedes. I really like the way you presented a complex, presentation of the relationship between fascism and nationalism in a way that transcends this binary that even Hobsbawm put out there, like 19th century good, 20th century problematic. And I was thinking about the case of Spain that you know well, and I was asking Angel about this because, as you know, in the Spanish Civil War, one side was identified with a system of government, the Republican side, and the other one was the Bando Nacional, identified with nationalism, which is no longer, related to a system of government, rather to an ethnicity/religion. And I think this is like a way to see this. And the guy I'm studying right now, just a small comment, which is Leopoldo Lugones in Argentina, he was anti-clerical, he was a nationalist. By the end of his life, he himself realized that there was a contradiction between the two, and he killed himself. And he said, I can no longer write a biography of Roca, who was the liberal president who engaged in genocide against Native Americans or Native Argentine Americans, and he couldn't integrate the two. He was writing a biography of Roca, and he said, stop, I cannot continue. So there is a contradiction there. But the contradiction is, and I finish here, it's theoretical. In practice, there are so many correlations, even genocidal ones.
Okay, final responses to this from each of you.
So I'm going to be very quick because Pam's question, I really love the question because neutrality is the key theme of the book I'm working on. I've been working on forever. But so I could tell you so many things. So I'm going to just try and we can talk about it later. I think neutrality is pretty important. I think sometimes we forget that actually, in my view, I think some countries don't need to be invaded because if you can have a neutral with which you can collaborate in many ways, it's much, much better. And that is the case of Spain in many ways. Spain is, I will argue, Spain, there's a point during the Second War that it is much more valuable to Germany, for example, as a neutral. It's not valuable if it comes into the war, so why make it, right? So I think neutrality, there's a lot there that we could talk about. And but if I continue, I will not finish this panel. So, yeah. And Federico, yes, sorry. So if I gave this impression of a binary, that was not my intention. It's more that it was 20 minutes, so I couldn't, right? That's why I said to Manuela, I did have that issue of, are they different or not? And that's why I think that whole thing about it's both, I think fascist nationalism is both a continuation and a reaction to it. And if it is a continuation, it's because there are a lot of commonalities, obviously. But there's clearly a reaction because they think, well, liberal nationalism is not serving the nation enough anymore. So clearly something needs to happen. So that would be the nuance that I would add to that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will just respond to Pamela because I know we're running out of time. Real quick note, using empirically all the great evidence that Mercedes put out there, because you mentioned neutrality. This is part of my point about liberal imperialism, or what we would now call neo-Wilsonianism or neoconservatism. Some of it goes back to the French Revolution. They really think they can export their model everywhere, right? Whether it's Napoleon and the French Revolution, Wilson, Dick Cheney, that it is liberal, right? We can make everyone like us. It's not essentialist. It's not diversitarian. Of course, they end up, destabilizing the entire Middle East, killing people. But that's more ambitious than most fascists. I agree with Mercedes. Some fascists are like, we don't even want to go outside our borders. Let's worry about purifying our own area, our own region. In that sense, liberal imperialism can be more aggressive and less neutral. I don't think America can ever be neutral because of that liberal imperialist or Republican impetus. Fascists like Spain and Portugal say, you know what? Now that we're in charge here, it's too much effort to get colonies. We can focus. So the fascists are always trying to show that they care about global presence, but it's usually, as you pointed out, finding their own ethnicity in other countries and working through them. Spanish, Francophone people, Germanophone somewhere else. They're not really trying to get people who speak Swahili in Africa to become German or Spanish. So that's my response there. And then that's linked to the idea about Herderian versus Hitlerian diversitarianism or romanticism. Herder's pre-biological, but were he around post-Darwin, he would say there are actual scientific features, climate, genetics, that mean different races might have different proclivities or what have we now know that's problematic. but it would still be a eugenical argument. And the eugenicists in the Third Reich had some problems, as Richard Wetzel. Oh yeah, sorry. The eugenicists did not do well with Hitler and Himmler because they wanted to make it on science, not myth.
Okay.
That would be my response.
Thank you all very much.